Dear ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome you all to BLRC's book reading project. So we have here Adam Soul, who is a very renowned public figure in at least in the literary field, you know all. So before talking to him, I would like to tell a little bit about our project. So BLRC's book reading project is a project which is a year-long project. People of any age may join us. They come here to get the books, which are all Bengali books in English translation. We provide these books to read, and readers take these books, read these books, and then some of them write reviews. And the most exciting part is the readers between age 14 and 30, they read the books and then they write the review on them. And BLRC will publish the best 10 writings at the end of the project, and they will get, the best 3 of them will get monetary gifts as well. So this project, we are planning to provide the books to everybody. Whoever is interested to get them and read them is the best way to know about our own culture, literature, and the Bengali way of life. So we are very happy today to get Adam Soul among us today. So let's learn a little bit about him from Sweetie.
Hi everyone. So as Tasmina said, today our featured guest for this month is Adam Soul, who is a Canadian poet originally born in New York. He is the author of literary works such as Jonah's Promise, Crowd of Sounds, Jeremiah, Ohio, and Complicity. He has won 2 Ontario Trillium Awards for poetry. He is a university professor and also an avid basketball fan, according to his Twitter bio. And now I'm going to give it to Marilyn.
So, I've actually never done an interview before, so this is the first time. I'm kind of scared, but I mean, it's just a conversation. We'll just have kind of a conversation. And I'd like to get started by asking, who is Adam Soul? Who are you? I mean, yes, you are a Canadian-American poet, but were you always a poetry fan, you know, in love with the words that make people feel something real?
So, do you want me to take that? So, I did always like poetry, but I think I liked a lot of things when I was young, and I liked music, I liked all sorts of things, but I got lucky in university. I was interested, I took a course, I was interested in a number of things, theater, but I took a course my very first semester of university. I had no idea who the professor was when I took the course, but by the end of the semester I knew exactly who he was because he was in all the anthologies that I had read. And he won the Pulitzer Prize later that year. His name was Philip Levine. And that he really changed my life and changed the way I thought about the possibilities of being a poet. And from then I continued to get lucky with teachers and to pursue good teachers and to learn from my peers, and that's when I really changed. I think that first semester, I still think back on how scared I was that first semester and how it changed me.
No,
okay.
So would you say that was the initial spark that kind of, you know, pushed you to write your first poem?
I mean, the spark was there. I think a creative spark is in all of us, and I was cultivating it in very different ways from childhood. So that is much older. I think, you know, the change that happens, you know, unfortunately for some, is that they find that creative spark has to move to the side in order for them to pursue a life. And for me, I was lucky enough to find a place where I could cultivate that creative spark and pursue a professional life. Some just pursue the creative spark and never pursue a professional life too. But I always, you know, played music. I always did those kinds of things as a kid. So I feel, and you know, my family supported it. There was always music in my home and growing up, and so that definitely helped me cultivate that spark.
So growing up and right now, who would you say your favorite poets are, or writers even?
I always have trouble with this because there are dozens. You know, there's the one I was reading this morning before I got in the car to come here. I'm reading a new book by Adam Dickinson that I think is very interesting that just came out. So I'm very, very recent things, but I also teach Walt Whitman over and over again, the great American poet from the 19th century, and he still makes me happy every time I read him. And you know, Deborah Diggs was another teacher I had who I still think a lot about, and about the way she moves poems around, and you learn, it's a craft. I mean, it starts off as a creative spark, but if you wanted to pursue any art form, you also have to learn its craftsmanship, you know, then, and so, so I'm reading, so that's how I read sometimes now. I read sometimes, how did she do that? You know, how did that turn a phrase evoke this feeling in me when, if she had worded it in a different way, it would have done nothing. You know, why is that? Why does, you know, I want to get under the hood of the machine and see how it works.
Well, you know what they say, curiosity generates the idea.
Yeah, that's true.
So would you say they're kind of like your idols, inspire you to write your books or your poems?
I mean, you know, I think you first, yeah, who are my idols? I mean, there are my peers who I feel the closest to in voice, you know, and so I feel in some ways that they are the ones who understand me best, and can see, maybe even before I do it, where I'm going to move, you know, and there are still, I'm, you know, not old enough that there are, you know, that they've all died off, those above me, the teachers that I've had. Some have, but there are older poets who I admire very much and who I continue to learn from, who, yeah, they inspire me. You know, you want to be a part of that. You want to, you know, you want to make poems that have the same kind of resonance and power.
To relate on your own level.
Of course. Yeah.
Right. Well, so I have a question for you, which kind of asks you if you go through the Brightest Blog, because I know that many writers, I'm sure, go through Brightest Blog or struggle to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
You know, would you say you've ever experienced something like that?
So this, and I'll tell you why. For me, it's like playing with the paint. You know, like for me, I love the medium. I love the instrument. There are times when I write a lot of garbage and don't keep anything. Or there are times that I'm too busy to really write, and that can be frustrating. But I love the blank page. I love the feel of pen on paper. And when I'm just getting started, like this time of year now, you know, the school year's ended, I teach. So often at the end of the semester, I don't get any writing done because there's too much marking to do and the end of year busyness and all of that. And then just when I start to free up a little bit again, I pull out my folders, and I like to work on like scrap sheets of paper at the back. No, not that, but like this. Like this is the extra copy of the syllabus. So I have that, you know, and I'll start writing words down. For me, that's part of the fun, you know, and finding a turn of phrase. And I guess I'm never afraid to throw it out at the end of the day. If it's garbage, it's garbage. And you know, in the way a piano player just loves his instrument, I love the instrument of language. And so if I sit down at the piano and make a lot of lousy work and lousy noises that day, it's still a better day than it is digging ditches, you know. And so I never have trouble. Writer's block isn't the feeling I have. I think some of that, people who do have that, it's about fear. You know, do I have to make something good? I have to make something good, so the choices I make from the very beginning have to be very thought out. You know, for me, when I first begin, I don't worry about making something good. I just want to make something, and that's the pleasure for me. I'll worry if it's good later.
So you do it for yourself?
I do it at first just for the sheer pleasure. I mean, it is really even just a sensual pleasure for me. Like, I like the way it feels in my hand, though I like the way the ink, or pencil sometimes. I like the physical sensation of writing. And so even if I'm just making up words, it's fun for me at the beginning. And then as I continue, then hopefully I start to do something a little more than that.
But as you said, flow of inspiration comes to you through wherever.
Still a graduate student. I sent that book, or a version of that book, to 50 different publishers before it was extended. 50 zeros.
Wow.
Yes. So this is my way of encouraging you and not to take rejection too seriously. For the first book is always the hardest book to publish. You have your whole life to write your first book. I used to, when I was a student, I had a little apartment, and I would put the rejection letters on my wall. I would tape them to my wall, and then I ran out of wall space. And it motivated me. For some that would be too depressing, but for me it sort of got me just a little bit angry, and that helped me
Write better.
To write better and to continue and to keep sending things out. You don't know when your manuscript is in front of some editor's desk. Maybe they spilled coffee on their lap just before they read. You have no idea. Maybe their cat died yesterday. So if that happens, there's no way they can see your manuscript for what it is. And so you keep going and you try to get better. Of course, you try to get better. But you don't worry too much about those rejections. You just keep going forward. And so that first book, finally, it won a little prize, and the winning book was published. So it was published by a little publisher in the United States, in Minneapolis, and that sort of got me started.
And tone of the poems, do you think?
I mean, a title can... I'm not great with book titles. I don't like them. I don't know. I struggle making them. Poem titles are fine, but I mean, what you're trying to do with a book title is give a hint at what the whole collection is circling around. Like that, complicity is the sun around which the poems are planets. And they don't always. They're not. Some of the poems are distant planets, and some of the poems are close planets, right? But the title tries to give that force of gravity and to collect them. And what this book is about, in many ways, about feeling indirect guilt and pain for things that are happening in the world. Whether it's a violence that's happening, or difficulty with gender issues. There are a lot of poems that are trying to work through these kinds of struggles. And where do you place yourself, if there's violence happening across the sea, but it's your government participating in it, it's not guilt exactly, but it is complicity. And so that's sort of how I came to the title. This is a bad example because it's not very funny. I should find one that's better. That's funny.
Nothing is bad.
No, I know. No, but as long as I said something about humor, I should probably... Well, anyway, I'll read this one first. It's called Engagement. The young man knows he's going to die today, but he's wrong. The other young man figures the army is the best way to improve his life, but he's wrong. They both think their weapons will protect them, but they're wrong. They both believe their prayers will help. Their commanders have intentions and intelligence, but they're wrong. We've heard the story before, it's wrong. The news will document it, but it will be wrong. The medium, the reception, the commentary, the commercial break. The explosion will exceed the necessity of the occasion. The exchange of fire will be unbalanced. The response will be disproportionate. The reporter is factually incorrect, morally misinformed. The clear typeface and perfect binding are misleading. The reader is uncomfortably and inappropriately implicated. The tranquil mind is insufficient to the task. The young men, necks dirty and damp, advance.
Yeah, we liked it.
Example, the first one warmed me up. Now the longer, so this one is a little bit about a lot of different things. One is about art in the world and how people love to say that art has no impact on the world. And the other is about Pluto, the planet Pluto, which has gone back and forth. Sometimes it gets demoted and it's not a planet anymore, and it's a minor planet or a semi or whatever it's called. And then sometimes it gets, so when I wrote this poem, it had fairly recently been booted out. It was no longer considered a planet. So I was thinking about that, about these definitions. And it also has a quotation. And so there's a group of astronomers who make those decisions, who try to define what a planet means, and that's the AIU. It's the International Astronomers Union, I think. I don't know, the AIU. So they're mentioned in the poem. And, and there's a quotation from a basketball player, because I am a basketball fan. There's a basketball player named Ron Artest, who changed his name to Meta World Peace, and then changed his name to Friend of Pandas, and then changed his name back to Meta World Peace. So he's an interesting fellow. And he was always, as you can imagine, gave good interviews, because he's a quirky guy. And they asked him about Pluto. Or he said, they asked him about something, he said, oh yeah, he played like he was from Mars or from Pluto. He said, I grew up with Pluto as a planet, and now I'm 25, I turn around and Pluto's no longer a planet. I gotta find that guy and elbow that guy in the nose. Which I thought was fantastic. It's a great quote. But the problem was, it took me a very long time to figure out why would you punch him in the, but he really said elbow a guy in the nose. And then another poet, this very nice lady, said to me, she's a poet, Maureen Hines, she's a very good poet, you should have her come. She said, no, you do it like this. So now I know. And that's the epigraph of this poem, which is called Dwarf, which is what the Pluto was.
What's the name, sorry?
Dwarf. A dwarf is, so it was demoted to being a smaller planet.
Oh, DWARF?
Correct.
Okay.
Dwarf. For one day, I will not be ironic about the power of art. For one day, I will try not to be ironic about the power of art. Tonight, the president will use his best rhetoric to make a case for more. More blood, more debt. I will sit in my love seat and wait for insight. I will detect this insight by way of an inner ear organ that believes it knows, insight when it hears it. My inner ear likes the president's rhetoric, more effort, more death. Sometimes it sounds like insight. At other times, it sounds like a man's voice in search of insight. For me, for my inner ear, the sound of this searching is as close to insight as is usually available. In other news, Pluto has been demoted to a dwarf planet by the IAU's Working Group on the Definition of a Planet. It has something to do with lopsidedness and something to do with lack of influence. Quote, bodies that dominate their neighborhoods sweep up asteroids, comets, and other debris, clearing a path along their orbits. By contrast, Pluto's orbit is somewhat untidy. And so the children weep because on their cartoon maps of the solar system, Pluto, the 9th planet, has been replaced with an unhappy face. They write pleas to their congressman who can do nothing. But today I have promised to stand by the claims of art, to believe in things that, while as far from the tables of power as Pluto is from Poughkeepsie, to believe that they may have, that they may, fire and desperation and hunger and belief, how to account for them, how to measure their significations. What can the cockeyed orbit of Pluto teach us about our earthly sufferings? Chen Li wrote, traveling in the family of poetry is the most substantial and warmest link on the lonesome journey in the universe. If Mr. Li wants to learn about loneliness, he should go to Pluto, whose orbit extends to 7.4 billion kilometers from the sun, and where there is no poetry, though plenty is hurled hopefully up on its behalf. It is a truism that, like a child, art has no inherent use and is often a draw on our resources. As my grandfather once wrote, "Why do men write poems? Why do men live?" In those days, men meant everyone, but recently the masculine general pronoun has been declared a dwarf pronoun by the IAU's working group on the definition of pronouns. It will be a long winter on Pluto, 100 years roughly. Here it is the season of fallen fledglings. They litter the sidewalks of this bulbous city, some attracting flies, some cheeping stupidly, asking for help from parents who understand the truth and have begun their morning rituals. Sometimes storekeepers scoop the birds up into shoeboxes and try to save them. It's hard not to believe that Pluto would be insulted by its recent reclassification as a dwarf, which puts it on par with Eris, the goddess of discord. Discord is only halfway to hell, but it's also bigger. Meanwhile, art has been declared a dwarf pursuit by the IAU's working group on the definition of pursuits. No, I've promised. We are moon makers. We take balls of ice and blow on them until they seem to hover and spin. Sometimes they achieve an untidy presence that the president may refer to when he helplessly casts about more debt, more death, looking for a way to explain. Pluto has 3 known moons: Hydra, a monster; Charon, the ferryman to Oblivion; and Nyx, his mother, who is Oblivion. Even Oblivion has an orbit. Even Oblivion bends the light. Very violent and sort of worrying time. And I think we're all aware of that. But I'm also not there. You know, I'm an American, I vote in the United States, but I'm not there. And we read about violent things happening in the paper, or what happened here in Toronto just a couple of weeks ago, but I wasn't there. And so I'm trying to think about what it means to be affected by these big moments, or even little but scary moments, and how we respond to them. You know, what are we supposed to do? You can donate to a fund, sure, but how are we supposed to feel about that kind of thing? So there's a series of prayers traditional Jews say in the morning when they first wake up. There are about 20 of them. And I'm starting each, using that as a framework for about half of the manuscript, one poem in response to each of these prayers. But the world that's happening includes violence. You know, I'm writing this poem, I'm saying this prayer that, you know, thanks God for making me a free person. There's one prayer. But at the same time, there are police, you know, around in full Kevlar looking for somebody. You know, so I'm trying to kind of combine those things.
Sounds interesting.
We'll see.
There was a question.
Yeah.
So my question is kind of branching off of that. So different writers have different aspirations, and seeing that you've met some amazing milestones, such as getting published, winning awards. This is a very big question about what are your ambitions for the long term?
I want to keep writing books. You know, I like the ambition doesn't usually go past that. Like when I start just writing poems, and when I start to think, okay, this is starting to look like a book. It's like this, you know, the folder is this thick now. That's starting to look like a book. This is about long enough to be a book for me. So these are just notes. This is what I'll write on later. So of course, you hope the book does well. You hope people like it. If it wins an award, great. You know, that's a bonus. But you know, to be able to keep going, to be encouraged enough that publishers are interested in me, and that I can continue to grow that way. I try to keep my head up to the ground on that way. You know. Would I like to win the Nobel Prize? Sure. Why not? I don't think that's what, do I want my book to do well? Yes. I think you think, if you start thinking too far, then you can get yourself in trouble. But, do I want this book to be published? Do I want it to do well? Do I want my people to admire it? Yes. Those are ambitions that I can. Do I want to still be writing 30 years from now when I'm in my late 70s? Yes. Those are ambitions.
To me, poetry is a reflection of contemporary society, a societal expectation. And I see each of the poet want to convey a particular message through their poetry or their literary works. What would be your message to the society in general?
So I'm going to disagree with you a little, because to me there isn't one message. The poet is not a preacher. The poet is not a politician. She doesn't have to have one answer. So for me, like with that engagement poem, who's supposed to win? Do their prayers really help? I don't know. For me, what I'm trying to get at is to capture that moment of crisis. Or in the poem about the planets and does art really matter? No, yes. I want to capture the no, yes. And so for me, the artist's responsibility is the message, if you were, is to highlight the conflict more than to find a solution. Right? If you can, even if you're writing about something very difficult, very, can you humanize the other? Can you make that moment feel alive, feel fresh to you, even though you weren't there? That to me is more the message of the poet, to see things differently, to see things in a more complicated way, with more sympathy. That to me is more important than any specific political message. If I wrote if I have a political idea, I'll write it and it'll be terrible, it'll be boring. I'm not good at it. But the poems that may have a political feel, what's interesting about them, their message, if you will, is about complication, is about empathy, is about questions.
Well, yeah, of course.
You are usually the last,
Yeah.
so you should.
I want to be the
next to
last.
Go on. Yeah. I kept that position for you. Actually, my question has two parts. I'm really touched by your poem Engagement, and referring to that poem, I find that say you are different parts of the world now. There's a conflict is going on, and two parties with two ideologies, two ideas, and thinking they are fighting. But the bottom line is they're trying to kill each other. Fantastic. But as a poet, we know that we cannot actually capture the whole truth. No one can, because even we are watching a football match in the same stadium, sitting in different galleries, we are actually viewing different games.
Sure.
So, do you develop your perception, your ideas, your thinking, and the what you are going to reflect in your poem? That's from the media, from your conscience. What is the source? What influences you more? That is my first question. And second thing is, you also referred to the changing it. As a poet, 15 years ago, the poet you were, and now you're not the same person. So, and everything is changing, only changes, we call it in the dialectical materialism, everything is changing, but change is unchanged.
Yes.
So, do you think that as a poet, it is the responsibility of a poet to chase the change or to preach? Maybe you have already mentioned that poet is not a preacher, I know, but to write something which is based on your conscience, your learning, your values, which is developed from your time, your teaching, learning, and a lot more.
Those are big questions. The question about how does a poet respond to his situation, of the world. I mean, one of the things that I like to think I can do, that I do as a poet, is to try to include more influences in a poem. So the poem about, it's history calling me. For me, you know, one of the ways that we experience history now must include television, because that's part of how we experience history. So if you're going to be a poet writing about contemporary events, television has to make an appearance, or the internet, or whatever, you know. And so the challenge then as an artist is how, because I look at you know, the great Walt Whitman from the 19th century. He didn't have to deal with television. So how do I, you know, use some of that spirit, of Whitman's spirit, if he's my influence or he's one of my heroes, but I'm in a world that he doesn't understand, you know. And so how do I include all of those things? How do I account for them? You see art in the world, or if that changes the way you see fledglings, you know, good. That's something that my poem does, that makes my voice unique. That doesn't mean an old girl who's reading those poems online might also be interested in some other poets. And if she welcomes them into the art form, that's also good. And frankly, that ultimately is good for me too. Like, you know, I guess I have nothing bad to say about her. Let her live and be well, and continue to do work, and continue to get better, you know. Don't feel like that's a problem.
So in your view, in your opinion, what do you prefer more? That the poetry should be in everyday language for all people, or it should be more rich?
Does there have to be only one or the other? There can be Rupi Kaur, and there can be Ken Banstock, who, you know, much more different.
What do you prefer personally?
I mean, I think I can make it clear. I lean towards one side of things, and that's okay too. You know, the poets that I read tend to have a little more, you know, but I also know that I'm a privileged reader in certain ways. I've had a lot of education, and I've been reading poetry a long time. And so the things that excite me in the poem are not going to be the same things that excite a 12-year-old girl, you know, alone on the internet, you know. And so I guess the world has room for all of us, it feels to me. You know, this is why if people say to me that poetry is having a problem, you know, that nobody reads poetry, I sort of think they're silly. They're just not observing. People may not buy books that look like this as often, although Rupi Kaur proves that wrong too. You know, so I let them work on it. It doesn't